Welcome to our inspirational conversation today. With us we have Peter Wahlgren and Petter Rönnborg, and we're going to discuss some different trends today. So let's start with our first topic, the future of global logistics and supply chain. So as of today, what geopolitical risks are we seeing, and what are their biggest consequences?
That whole industry has been turned upside down over the last 2-3 years with COVID, and then of course the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The whole shipping industry has gone berserk in all kinds of ways. But I think there's a bigger sort of question on what type of risks are companies willing to take when it comes to their supply chain and their logistics. And shipping is sort of the ultimate place where you see the effects immediately when someone stops buying something, or when oil is in a short supply or something. The shipping suffers directly or benefits immediately.
We need to sort of reinvent the wheel here. Resource depletion and the distribution of wealth and all the turmoil that is creating, and how are we going to solve these problems? That is a major challenge, I think.
So we know we need to be less vulnerable to some of these bottlenecks and some of these sort of very long-haul supply chains we have, and just-in-time deliveries when the whole system is sort of under stress. So I think we need to rethink a little bit of our logistics in terms of making it more less vulnerable for small disturbances that cause enormous effects.
So many companies turn to technology to increase transparency and control. What trends do we see in this area in terms of logistics and supply chain?
I think from my perspective, again, with a little bit of a focus on shipping and logistics, is the tracking and tracing and transparency in supply chains, to know where your goods are, to know where, how much they cost when they're going to arrive. The whole the IT sort of enablement of actually being in control, that's one of the obvious sort of drivers for doing things differently. But what I think is less obvious is how the value chain in these logistics paths will change. What kind of players can take a marketplace in supplying things?
But another question, how do you see that the power will shift between companies and their suppliers?
I mean, when it comes to resource scarcity, if you are on a resource that is scarce and that is needed, I mean, then you have a definite power.
And how do we see, how has companies tried to deal with this issue? Thinking of like the unreliable transportation.
But I think we already seen some changes in sourcing strategy. I think in automotive industry, I think it's a good example where cabling has been sourced from a sole supplier that happened to be in Ukraine. And suddenly no one can get cables of a certain kind. And now that has been sort of distributed to 2 or 3 suppliers instead, which is of course a much less risky approach. But that's what happens when you have sort of a long-term or long time of very durable and very stable supply and a relative peace. And then suddenly you have a inability to get one key component and you can't deliver a truck. So I think that mindset, I think, is new to a lot of modern businesses, is to actually reduce the single point of failures. And I think we have a lot of them in our industry still.
And then these geopolitical risks, again, I mean, we're talking about the semiconductors, most of that, from what I understand, is based on Taiwan. And with the growing appetite of power from our big friends in the East, I mean, what's going to happen there?
So when we're on the topic of future potential geopolitical risks and an unstable landscape that we're currently in politically, how do you see the future of preparing to deal with these future potential challenges? How are companies adapting?
I would hope that most companies will do a lot of more scenario planning, understand a lot more of the alternatives of doing business. I think when everything works well, you take away all the thinking of what if scenarios. What can I do? How can I source this cable elsewhere? How can I do this differently? And I think a lot of data and knowledge is actually going to support that type of thinking, because I think a lot of the underlying sort of sub-businesses that support the building of a truck, for instance, is unknown to the truck builders. So with more transparency and information, I think you can actually do better scenario planning.
What opportunities do we see there to use datafication?
Opportunities are endless.
Exactly.
Yeah. So first of all, I think you can look at consumer business and try to take the best of what's being done there, in terms of personalization, in terms of advertisement, in terms of putting basically cookies in your customers' way of working, so you can serve them much better. How is it possible that you can have an engine failure and you call up the manufacturer and they have no idea who you are and what parts you need, what serial number of the engine you have, etc. You know, there's so many things that B2B could be able to do much better with datafication that could serve your customer much better.
Yeah, I'm also thinking of, so speaking of big data and how it's used in companies, if we connect it to the logistics and production part that we talked about earlier, big data is also becoming more of a trend in the production scenario with Industry 4.0. How do we see it being used there?
What is it that the customer will need when the customer needs it? So we will probably be able to reduce the inventories, for example. That's what I'm hoping for, because we are tying up so much money in inventories that could be used for other things. So that's a huge opportunity if we could link the sort of the demand side much better into the production and supply.
Using it more in a predictive kind of way.
Absolutely.
There's definitely players in your value chain that are not necessary, and the only way to get rid of them is actually to create some of that transparency you talked about, to have a full visibility in the supply chain and actually place the order all the way down instead of placing it here.
So I think we'll start to leave the topic, but is there anything you'd like to add?
What I would like to say is I think these kind of conversations that we have had here today is very important to practice in any organization. If we can learn to have those conversations and build on that, I think that is it's a very strong capability to build on.
I would agree to have this setting. We don't know each other.
No, I've never met you before.
No, and we've had fantastic conversations on topics that are very big, and I think just it's been very stimulating, and I think sort of synergizing with minds and co-create on new thinking.
So thank you so much for coming, and thank you for a very inspirational discussion.